IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am your host Saurabh Todi, and I have with me my colleague Shambhavi Naik, and we are going to discuss an important development. So the Supreme Court last week reserved its judgment in the case filed in 2004 initially about the need to have GMOs in India. The brief background Shambhavi will describe, and we'll discuss the implications of this and a lot different types of public policy and scientific issues that come with this issue. So a very warm welcome, Shambhavi.
Thanks, Saurabh. And let me start by correcting you. So it was a very important non-development that happened last week. The fact that there was no judgment. I think judgment any which way would have been helpful, but a reserved judgment I think is the worst of them all. And the other is that this was about GM mustard. So India does allow GMOs to be grown, GPT cotton. It's just that we still haven't made a decision about whether we should allow cultivation of genetically modified food crops or crops for consumption, because people perceive there will be issues with health or with an environment if we allow for a broader ambit of genetically modified crops to be grown in the country. Right, so that's where we are. The GM mustard was initially developed in 2002 to a considerable cost. I think with a lot of public money that also went into the development. It was developed in the Delhi University through collaborations, and is known to increase yield of mustard by 30%, and it also has an added feature of being herbicide resistant. So basically, if you're growing it and there are weeds around and you want to destroy the weeds, you can spray herbicides on the plant itself and the plant won't die, but the weeds will. So it's supposed to ease agricultural processes in a way if you want to use it. I think often GM mustard gets talked about as a herbicide resistant plant, but that's not its core characteristic. The 30% increased yield, I think, is irrespective of the herbicide feature. The herbicide feature got added in because the system that was used to create the GM mustard had this as a part of the process. And it's just complicated biology because mustard is a self-pollinating plant, and therefore so normal techniques could not be used for creating the hybrid, and they had to use this system. I'm not saying that this is the only system that could be used, but I just want to reiterate that a lot of arguments that you will see against GM mustard are for the herbicide resistant feature, but it is not the central feature.
Yeah, no, I agree, and the point well taken that we have VT cotton for a long time, and it has shown to be successful. So it's not like it has not worked, but the everlasting argument about whether we should have GM crops for food is still ongoing, and sadly to this day. So Shambhavi, what are the arguments that have been presented by the petitioners against? So just a brief background. So last year in October, the government gave the go ahead to do field trials of GM mustard at 8 locations. It is a closed, it is a trial like in the ground, so like not in the lab, but it is a controlled environment. Like it is not completely out in the open, as in like the location is within the agricultural institutes or places which are monitored by scientists, and that was challenged in the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court stayed that decision by the government in November. So what has been this argument which happened both in December and then this month as well?
Right. So I think obviously GM mustard is now a case study because of the number of times people have taken it to court and the number of times We have delayed or managed to delay the actual testing of uh, of these of this crop. Before I go into actually GM mustard, I want to talk about one overarching argument that we hear a lot about any GM, which is the fact that GM crops fail. And this has been said about BT cotton as well. Oh, BT cotton fails. And I don't think that's the correct use of the term fails. It is just evolution at work. So we know that the bollworm eats cotton, so we created cotton which could be resistant to the bollworm. And as things happen and life evolves, the bollworm eventually got resistant to the mechanism that BT cotton uses to develop resist to create to induce resistance. And so then we had second generation, third generation BT cotton. Right? This is not failure. This is just life. This is what you expect when you grow.
Yeah, plus, I mean, I think this idea that, I mean, to expect that, okay, if you have one GM crop and it should never fail and it should just remain workable for the entire lifetime, it's kind of absurd, because that is akin to, I would say, that, buying a machinery and like hoping that it would never break, or
Yeah.
it would never have end of life. Once it serves its purpose for a reasonable amount of time, then you would have to upgrade, you will have to change. So this idea that, I mean, yeah, this is quite
Yeah. And you see it, I mean, you see it so often. You see it now with antimicrobial resistance. Yes, we developed antibiotics, then the microbes developed resistance to the antibiotics, then we developed second generation, and now we are really struggling to, find better antibiotics which will still continue to work, because a lot of pathogens have now learned what antibiotics we use and developed resistance. That is how life works.
Yeah.
That's how it will also work with GMOs. So to think that a GMO is a silver bullet and to create arguments against it saying that it is not going to solve all of problems is a little silly, because yes, it is not going to solve all problems. Nothing does. Right? It is how, with a given technology, what would be the appropriate way to use it is the discussion we should be having. And I think arguments then can be made that, hey, do we need to use it now? And I think that's a much fairer conversation to have, understanding its benefits and risks, and do those benefits outweigh risks right now for us to try it. I think it's a much fairer ground to have these discussions than to come into the discussion saying, hey, this is either going to solve all of India's agricultural problems, or this is just going to kill all of India's biodiversity and therefore we should ban it. Right? These are kind of the two end spectrum arguments that we continue to hear. And I think that premise itself is problematic. Right? So I just wanted to lay this out, that when we at Takshashila think about gene editing and GMO crops, our understanding is that, okay, there are various forms of agriculture. GM technology is one form of agriculture that India needs to pursue, because we really don't know at what stage in our future it might become necessary that India has to deploy GM technology, because, very simply put, natural evolution cannot keep up with climate change. Right?
Yeah.
So crops will find it increasingly difficult to adapt to just the sheer rate of climate change that we have induced, right? So we have to also then make sure that we have enough expertise
Yeah.
to create crops literally at will, if required,
yeah.
to adapt to those changes.
Plus, it also allows people to also be more familiar with it, right? If, for example, due to climate change or rapid kind of changes, you suddenly introduce like just plethora of GM crops in the market, people may also feel, okay, what has happened? What is, like, is this okay? Is it acceptable? So it only would further breed suspicion.
Yeah.
But if it is slowly introduced, one crop after the other with more trials, and there have been many that are just, I mean, our agricultural research institutes have been ready with at least so many different varieties. It's just that the permissions are not given.
Yeah.
So I think doing it in a step-by-step manner is much more effective. But yeah, so I want to come back to, so what you highlighted are mainly the arguments against GM mustard. But can you elaborate on what what have been the arguments against GM mustard in the court?
Right. So I think there are several arguments. One is on one which is leading is obviously that it's going to impact biodiversity. That if we start with GM mustard, if we start bringing in more genetically modified food crops, then India will lose out on biodiversity. We have some 5,000 varieties of mustard. And they will all get replaced because you will have a super crop which is going to give. This is a little conundrum for me to explain, because the same people who will say that, oh, farmers will grow it because it will give them higher yield, will also say but farmers will then be impacted economically by it, because it is going to impact them uh, financially. So I don't know how those two kind of square up with each other. But okay, let us go with the argument that we have 5,000 varieties and we are going to bring in the super crop, and we are going to kind of now lose all of the 5,000 varieties, right? That could happen. Okay, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Maybe it is such a good crop that all farmers decided this is what we want to grow because it is going to give us money, right? And at this point of time, where India imports a lot of its oil, where India is actually dependent on foreign countries to serve its oil requirements, this is mustard oil, not the other oil. Is that a fair trade-off? And I would say yes. I mean,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what would you do with that variety if that variety is not it is not being able to fulfill your needs, and you anyway have to import, and that import is from varieties that are not from India.
Yeah.
So
and they are GM. Anyways.
And they are GM. Exactly.
GM. So you're anyways giving GMO mustard oil to most, and GM soya oil to people in this country. So you're not actually replacing much on the consumer side end. But we know that whatever Indian varieties there are clearly not matching up to the demand, right? And so if it's a question of preserving biodiversity, I'm sure we can create other policy avenues, banks, etc., to maintain our biodiversity. But whether the biodiversity is required to actually meet our agriculture requirements, I'm not sure.
And plus, I mean, if you allow GM crops, I mean, once the market is more free, once, for example, you don't have too many unreasonable restrictions on GM crops, there will be competing types of GM crops as well. It's not like you only need one GM mustard for entire India. Some other companies, some other scientists may be able to will be able to have a new variety, and you can have variety in that sense. A scientist should be able, like, who knows, maybe you can combine a few varieties that we have in India. So all of that requires an atmosphere and a policy environment where you can do that. Yeah, and even hybrids, right? Yeah. You can use non-GM techniques to make. And we have been using, I mean, all the rice. And I mean, are we saying that after the Green Revolution, our biodiversity of rice and wheat did not take a hit? I mean, now the high yielding variety, I mean, now farmers who grow for commercial reasons grow those high yielding varieties, which are not, quote unquote, naturally existing. I mean, it is natural, but it is not existing in the environment the same way, but they are now the dominant variety, and that is fine. This fascination with preserving biodiversity at the expense of losing income for farmers and endangering food security is just quite... And creating foreign dependence. Obviously. It is, yeah, it is very interesting. And actually, it is... I find it mind-boggling that we can say the same things, all of these diverse things in the same breath, and present it as an argument, right? Okay, so this was the biodiversity argument. The second argument is about the use of herbicides in agriculture, right? And I think even the Green Revolution has shown that the minute pesticide use went up, you saw a degradation of soil, you saw a degradation of water quality, and groundwater, seepage, etc. And one part of the equation is that if people started sowing GM mustard and using herbicides with it, will we start seeing similar sort of soil degradation? And again, it is a very realistic concern, right? I'm not going to say that it is not a concern at all. And I think the Supreme Court also at some point of time said that, hey, look, our farmers are not like foreign farmers, they are illiterate. And so we have to think for them when we think of the use of GM mustards in entirety, and not just from the science point of view.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
It is such a patronizing statement. Like
is.
it is, I mean, what you are saying is that the farmer in India does not know what is good for him or her. I mean, yeah, they may not be as educated, quote unquote, but they know what would work for them. If they grow something, how much it will yield, will it be useful? I mean, it is. I mean, it is so patronizing. I mean,
It is
who is
patronizing.
thinking for them? And to be honest, I'm preaching to the choir here. I mean, a lot of farmer groups are actually in favor of having GM crops
Yeah.
because it increases their yields, increases their incomes. So when farmers are okay with it, who are we to kind of think, oh my God, if it is our only concern that okay, we are concerned about something, I can say okay, it's an argument, but don't use farmers as like their shoulders to aim a gun at this, because they are the ones who actually want these crops.
Yeah, so okay, let us unpack that a bit. So there are some farmer groups which want GMOs. In fact, the first GMOs in India, BT cotton, came before we actually even legally allowed it because farmers wanted it. So they just got it and started using it. There are obviously also some farmer groups which are against GMOs, and I think our stance usually is that if in a diverse enough country, let the person make a choice.
Yeah.
Like you don't make a choice for them, so make it available, make it of a standard that would be acceptable for safety. So obviously you don't want GM crops which might endanger people's lives being grown.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the government's role should be to actually look at safety data.
Yeah.
And we'll come to safety data in a bit, but but once it is safe, the government should really get out of the way and say, okay, this is GM, this is non-GM, you grow what you want, and as a consumer you eat what you want, and that part we do too, right?
Yeah.
We do have labels on GM and non-GM food items, or
Mhm.
this contains GM items, etc., right? And I think there's a little bit of reason to this whole literacy argument. But again, if it is an argument, then I really don't want either the Supreme Court or the government to be making the decision for the farmers.
Yeah.
It would really be to equip the farmers to make the
Yeah, I
decision
mean,
for themselves.
we have FPOs and other organizations, and you could ensure, I mean, as a government or even as an NGO, that you make sure that you let the facts in front of the farmer, and then they can make an informed choice,
Yeah.
not make a choice for them.
Yeah, so that I find very, very, again, very intriguing that this was actually put forward as a reason. But okay, there is a genuine concern that if there is an abuse of herbicide use, it could lead to soil degradation. But again, this is why we keep on saying that there are several methods of agriculture, and the best practice is to actually practice more than one of them. And so you do one batch of GMOs, for example, then you do something else. I am not a agricultural farmer myself, so I have no authority to actually talk about this. But I mean, GM crops have been used the world over.
Yeah.
And there are best practices on how they should be used. One of the examples that we know of is BT cotton.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the BT cotton failing idea. So when BT cotton was first introduced, it came with the guidance that we should follow a 80-20 rule. So 80% of what you sow in your field should be BT cotton, and 20% should be non-BT cotton. This is because the bollworm which infests and destroys the crop could then feed on that 20%, and the remaining 80% you would be able to harvest. But because the bollworm is now not under a survivor pressure,
Mhm.
because we are allowing a little bit of population to keep on growing, it would develop resistance to BT slower.
Slowly, yeah.
But this was obviously not followed,
Mhm.
and that is why resistance to BT cotton came up much faster than
So is it
anticipated.
so? Was this not followed only in India or even
No,
globally?
globally.
Okay.
Globally, it wasn't followed as. I mean, I understand the scientific reason behind giving 80-20. I also understand why people would not
Why a
have
farmer will be
followed.
like, why should I waste 20% of my crop?
Now that I understand science and public policy both, I can see why this utterly and completely failed. But what I'm trying to say is that yes, herbicide use will be a concern, but with adequate training is the way out of it. Banning GM crops is not the way out.
Yeah, I mean, true, and I think the same kind of concern that, for example, the green revolution has had increased use of insecticides and pesticides. So I think that is obviously is a problem, but as you said, the solution is not to not have hybrids, right? The solution is to make sure that you educate farmers and you have programs in place that reduce that kind of behavior.
Yeah, and you learn from your mistakes,
Yeah.
and mistakes from others. I mean, like Sri Lanka banned GM
Yeah.
food, said we would only do organic farming, and it failed. Like the first year, it just dramatically failed, and they lost a lot of money because
Yeah.
of that. Kenya, I think, also banned. Kenya, one of the African countries, banned GM crops a couple of years ago. There was a drought for 3 years in a row. Crops could not survive. They ended up not only importing food but then removing the ban on GM crops because for their conditions they could not find ways to make hybrids quick enough. So they have to now use GM technology, and they don't really have a lot of time to make it. So when the Supreme Court says things like, oh, there is no compelling need for India to invest in GM mustard or GM technology, I don't think once that compelling need arises, we will have time.
No, I want to pick on that. I mean, see, this is like one of my like very like personal quibbles, is that the Supreme Court is now asking, is there a compelling reason to introduce GMOs or in this case GM mustard? First of all, who decides what is compelling? Right? Is Supreme Court the...
We are already importing. I don't know if that is not compelling. What is compelling?
No, I know, like, and see, that is why I think this has been a constant refrain, both from people in policy in the government or even judges who but only after they retire, is that, oh, we should not interfere in the domain of policy making. And so for that, I am curious that the Supreme Court's role in this would be at best to ensure that whatever rules and regulations have been laid down for assessment of GM crops are being followed. And if they are followed, then that is where the role of the Supreme Court ends. It is not in the domain of the Supreme Court to say whether India should or should not have GMOs. That is exclusively in the domain of executive and legislature. So why this kind of, this is quite, normal for the Supreme Court, sadly. But this is just crazy. And you're right, we import almost 50-60% of our needs. All of them, majority of them are from countries which anyway grow GM crops. So the oil is extracted from GM crops. Yes. So we are anyway using like GM oil, like GM derived oil. So what is the problem growing it in India?
So when the initial court cases happened, obviously the Supreme Court established a technical expert committee to give its report on whether India should have GMOs or not. And the technical expert committee, I think, basically came back saying that there are flaws in the regulatory system, and therefore now is not the correct time to bring in GMOs. Which, I agree. There are the regulatory system can be strengthened.
Yeah.
Like
should be strengthened. Yes.
The genetic the GAC is very opaque. We have never seen data come out from trials, etc. And I think just that transparency of data would be really helpful in making a case for GM crops. But it is opaque, and it does need strengthening. I don't think anyone will disagree with that. But again, then tell what's to be done with strengthening, right?
Yeah.
You can't ban the crops or the technology because
this logic like, oh, we have weaker systems, so let's not have it. It's the same thing. Like, if you can't regulate properly, for example, I would say the Supreme Court or courts, judiciary should say that, okay, the data regarding the trials and GM crops is in public interest, so you should release data. That is what the courts should do. And then the people and the companies and everyone can see for themselves whether they want to have it or not. But this idea that, okay, the government is happy that all the data is with them and there's no public scrutiny, and courts can just say, oh, well, we will not. It's
it's
just
frustrating. Calling something weak and saying that, hey, we should not do this because
It's funny, right? Like
There's a
there was
flaws.
no recommendation that, oh, there are flaws, these are ABCD are flaws,
Yeah.
fix them and then you can introduce.
Yeah.
But the idea was, oh, we have weaker systems. But I mean, even if you take that as face value, I mean, this the first case was filed in 2004 and the technical committee was set up in 2012. So it has been more than a decade.
It has gone back and forth quite a bit.
So we've improved. I guess, I mean,
So
both.
they did do a lot of long-term safety studies, not only for humans, but also honeybees,
Mhm.
pollinators, etc. Because in an open field,
Environment,
obviously, you have to see the impact on pollinators, and they have shown data that it's all safe. That's a other contestation point is what do people mean by long term? Because long term can be long, can be how much ever you want, and that's again a little unreasonable, I think, to expect. And also, I don't understand why we need to have all of these exalting standards of GM technology that we do everything else in our life so frivolously. Biodiversity, for example, then stop building buildings. I mean, if you're really that concerned about biodiversity.
Yeah.
So I don't want to indulge in whataboutery here, but I think the idea that GM technologies need to be held to some really high standard is weird. And again, if you want to hold it, set the standard. Don't ban.
No, and also, I mean, even if now let's say you bring geopolitics here, right? So it is remarkable that India has the highest percentage of arable land in the world as a per percentage of its total land area. It's higher than China, high in the US, and many other countries. It is the highest globally. Still, our agricultural product productivity is horrible. Like it is very low.
Yeah.
And obviously there are many other reasons. It's not just the GM crops or non-GM crops. There are many other factors, access to finance, small land holdings, and many other things. So it's not it is a multi-causal factor. But you see, and when we review, oh my god, China has so much of advantage, it has so much of like role to play in global agriculture market. That is because they also have very openly embraced GM crops as well.
Yeah.
They grow them substantially, and so with area a lot less than India, they are able to produce significantly more. And how do you compete with that? I mean, you can't just say, oh, we have 5,000 types of
Mustard.
mustard, so let's not. I mean, that's just crazy.
Yeah, I know. Anyways, the final argument that I've seen and made in this case is that a lot of the agriculture workforce which does weeding is women, and so if you switch to an herbicide-resistant plant and therefore start using herbicides, the women will lose their job, and therefore there will be a socio-economic impact felt in rural parts of the country. And I don't know why we cannot think of giving women better job as a solution.
Yeah, the thing is, oh my god, they will not be able to do weeding, so let's just not like de-weed stuff. Like what is this? I mean, you can
fact that their families might earn more money because of this, and
they might earn more, they may not have to work as hard, or they may be able to increase their skills and work in something else. It's not like the female workforce can't do anything else. It's just, and they also do it because again, it's a lot of hidden labor. A lot of them are just working there because they have to do it. It's not like, oh my god, I really want to do weeding. It's because they don't have access to other resources, or the fact that you have to do manual labor to do weeding. Now if there would not be as many weeds or much less weed, then that it frees up time, right, to do a lot different
tasks.
different tasks. So
and again, I think the government's role has to be to create those avenues.
Yes.
So yeah.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Shambhavi. It was an interesting conversation. Quite sad in many ways, but hopefully, I mean, as we said, the Supreme Court has reserved its judgment. So maybe we'll talk to you again when the judgment comes. Hopefully, it will not be as heated. We'll be more elated. that
I
okay.
strongly doubt it.
That
But I mean, we can't run away from the fact that at some point of time in the future, we are going to need GM technology. We can't run
and
away
at
from
that
it.
time we will
Yeah,
be
we're too late.
worried
Yeah.
that, oh my god, we don't have the capacities domestically and we have
Yeah.
to import it, and China is the largest supplier of GM seeds, and we may have to just live with that. So in that somber note,
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, everyone. And thank you, Shambhavi. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.